Muy buenos días a todas, todos, todes, de donde vengan, ya sea de México o de otros países. Nos da muchísimo gusto estar nuevamente en una sesión de nuestro Seminario Permanente de Antropología e Historia de los Racismos, las Discriminaciones y las Desigualdades. Este seminario, como saben, los que ya han estado aquí, es impulsado por el Seminario Universitario sobre Racismo y Xenofobia de la UNAM y también por la Dirección de Etnohistoria de Lina, con la participación del Centro de Investigaciones Interdisciplinarias en Ciencias y Humanidades de la UNAM. Y pues también nos da mucho gusto decirles que esta es nuestra sesión número 56 y que este año 2025 y el siguiente lo vamos a dedicar a temas de antirracismos en varias partes del mundo y con varias lógicas, porque cada antirracismo tiene lógicas en común con otros, pero también propias. Y bueno, tenemos hoy el gusto y el honor de tener como ponente a la doctora Anne-Marie Makulu. Espero haberlo pronunciado bien, Anne-Marie. Espero pronunciarlo bien. Ella es profesora asociada de Antropología Cultural y Estudios Africanos y Afroamericanos en la Universidad de Duke y tiene nombramientos adicionales en estudios de género, sexualidad y feminismo e innovación y emprendimiento. Makulu ha realizado investigaciones durante más de 2 décadas en Sudáfrica y es autora de Making Freedom, publicado por Duke University Press en 2015, sobre la transición de Sudáfrica a la democracia. También es coeditora de una colección titulada Hard Work, Hard Times, publicada en 2010 por la Universidad de University of California Press, que examina la migración africana, la búsqueda global de medios de vida y cuestiones de resiliencia cultural. Una segunda monografía en preparación, titulada, no sé si todavía está en preparación, titulada Beyond the Rainbow, Radical Hope for Another South Africa, y financiada por una beca del National Endowment for the Humanities, se centra en la pregunta cómo comprender las continuas y persistentes esperanzas y aspiraciones de los sudafricanos negros de un nuevo tipo de futuro cuando las condiciones de dicho futuro parecen haberse derrumbado. Makulu tiene muchísimas publicaciones, por ejemplo, artículos en Anthropological Quarterly y PMLA. Fue editora invitada de un número especial para el South Atlantic Quarterly y editora invitada de la sección temática especial de estudios comparativos del sur de Asia, África y Oriente Medio. También es coeditora de Cultural Anthropology Journals Colloquy, se dice on Citation, Race and Gender, que se llama Cite Black Woman. Ella se describe como cosmopolita, viajera a nivel mundial y viviendo en el exilio, africanista, urbanista y teórica radical. Dice que está casi recién casada. También se describe como habiendo madurado tardíamente, siendo dueña de un perro y siendo amante de la gastronomía y teniendo TOC. Y bueno, ella nos mandó un libro para que leyéramos la introducción y también un texto escrito por ella. Este libro se llama The Political Economy of Everyday Life Beyond Margins, que fue coordinado por Wael Adebanwi, ¿sí? Y bueno, es un libro muy interesante. Ella no se va a pegar hoy exactamente a este libro, pero bueno, yo le decía y le decíamos al principio de esta sesión que en América Latina pues tenemos bastante poca información precisa, digamos, y situada sobre África, África subsahariana y Sudáfrica. Y que, bueno, ella nos decía que va a tratar de tener una plática para un público como nosotros, pues que no tiene tanta información. Así que bienvenida, Anne-Marie. Y bueno, yo le voy a pasar la conducción de la sesión desde el punto de vista, digamos, logístico y técnico a Jimena Rodríguez, que es la secretaria técnica de nuestro seminario UNAM y que siempre nos asegura todo, toda la vida depende de ella. Cristina Masferrer, fundadora de este seminario y co-coordinadora conmigo del mismo, pues estamos encantadas de tener a todos ustedes aquí. Le damos la bienvenida en especial a Yolanda Moses, que bueno, es una muy destacada académica afroamericana que ya ha estado varias veces con nosotros. Bienvenida. Y bueno, vamos a tener la traducción simultánea de la empresa Ditsha, ¿cómo se dice? Ditsha, no sé, que va a estar a cargo de Carlos Arroyo y de Aida Mendoza. Bueno, Jimé, te paso el control del micrófono.
Gracias, Olivia. Solo quería dar un mensaje antes de darle la palabra a Ana María. Para todas y todos, tengo que quitarme esto porque estoy escuchando doble. Abajo, en la barra inferior del Zoom, van a poder encontrar un globito, el símbolo de un globito. Si no lo ven de inmediato, pueden picar en el botón de más y ahí van a poder ver una opción de interpretación en la que pueden elegir si quieren escuchar aquí en el Zoom en español o en inglés. Las personas que nos acompañan en el YouTube estarán escuchando en el idioma original, en inglés, así que si desean moverse para aquí al Zoom, háganlo. Saben, tienen el enlace en su registro. Cualquier cosa, yo estoy pendiente del chat de aquí del Zoom por si hay dudas de cómo usar la interpretación. Y también estoy pendiente del correo electrónico, para ver si quienes están en el YouTube necesitan apoyo. Voy a estar también compartiendo la pantalla de Anne-María, así que vamos a ver qué tanto se puede hacer al mismo tiempo.
Okay.
So, we are ready, Anne-Marie.
Yep.
Do you
Great.
want me to share right now, or do you want to start with some words and then you let me know whenever you want
That's
the
perfect.
presentation?
Okay.
Welcome again.
Thank you. So I understood some of what was going on just now. And I have to first say, I apologize for not being a Spanish speaker. So that's my bad. I speak French and some Italian, and Spanish somehow is not part of that. So my apologies. Thank you to the center and thank you to UNAM for inviting me. And I'm really very pleased to be making connections in a direction I really haven't done before. So I'm very grateful for that. I just wanted to frame a little bit what it is I'm going to try and do today. And I know that I sent on a piece for circulation. I think it will have given people a fairly general impression of some of the things I'm interested in and have been interested in now for over 25 years. I started working in South Africa in the late 1990s, right on the transition point when South Africa turned from its old white supremacist political system of apartheid and moved to democratize. This was in 1998. The piece that got circulated, I think particularly gives a clear impression of what will come up over and over again in this presentation, which is that it's very hard for me as someone working in South Africa to separate the question of class or socioeconomic status from the question of race and, in fact, racism. And I'm sure that that is a point that we can probably all agree on. These two things tend to collapse into one another. But of course, in different parts of the world, they collapse into one another differently. And so some of what I'm going to say has very much to do with the very particular place of South Africa on the continent of Africa, regionally, sub-Saharan Africa, and specifically Southern Africa. So all of these things are different. And as an anthropologist who is also considered someone who does African studies, it's also very challenging to make generalizations. The continent is 53 countries. How could one possibly know about all of those places. So my area of expertise is really just South Africa and to some degree Southern Africa. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say just preliminarily. To say also that I won't be speaking directly to the article that got circulated, but I think you'll be able to see the places where what I have to say converges with what I want to say today. Okay, I think we can start with the slides. Okay. Like I'm supposed to fill something in here. Okay. So I'll get back to this image in a minute, which is to say the installation, the art installation. But for now, the key issue here is to think about after the rainbow. So in the mid to late 1990s, after South Africa's transition to democracy, there were very key figures in South African civil society who were trying to establish a ground for the new, ostensibly free democratic society, and particularly to focus on moving beyond South Africa's long history of white supremacist rule, which was constitutionally mandated, and to think about a society that was intermixed, if you will. And so it was Archbishop Desmond Tutu, in the course of his role as Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who coined this phrase, the Rainbow Nation. In other words, we're all colors, we're all kinds of difference, and this is something to celebrate. That, expression of South Africa as a rainbow nation, I would argue, as a metaphor, as a political claim, as something that people can have a stake in, has really collapsed since the mid-1990s. And for younger South Africans of every color, but probably particularly Black South Africans, they refer to this as the current moment as post-rainbowism. So rainbow is out. The rainbow tended to paper over a series of problems. South Africa remained a racist society. It remained a society that was organized hierarchically around questions of race. And to say that we were all just getting along with one another really didn't accurately represent what was going on. And so part of my project the last 25 plus years has been first to think about the very early transition period in South Africa. You can probably move to the next slide. Right. So 25 years ago, I was thinking about iconic images like this one. I think everyone recognizes who this is, right? This is Nelson Mandela, who in 1990 was released from prison after being incarcerated for 27 years. And Winnie Mandela, who we understand more and more, was really not just the face of the anti-apartheid struggles outside prison, but probably the machine behind the anti-apartheid struggles outside prison. She was really running the show. So this is obviously an iconic picture. This is, I think, from 1990, after Mandela is initially released from Pollsmoor Prison in Cape Town, and then goes and delivers his first public address in the center of Cape Town, outside the old City Hall. You can go to the next slide. This is also just another image from that era. Right. Also probably an iconic image. It's fairly recognizable to South Africans. These are the queues or lines that's circled around, snaked around in the townships and in the central business districts and in rural areas in South Africa in 1994, when all South Africans, for the first time in the country's 350 years of colonial experience, were permitted to enjoy the right of the franchise and were able to cast a ballot in that very, very first non-racial democratic election. And if you go to the next slide, I think you'll see Mandela casting his own ballot, right? So this is also a very famous picture. So I arrived in South Africa in the late 90s. In 1998, I start fishing around for an ethnographic anthropological project, and I land in the city of Cape Town, recognizing that there's something peculiar going on there that seems in some respects different from things that are transpiring in the rest of the country. So at this point, South Africa is now 4 years into the new democratic dispensation. And there are many, many experiments in the realm of public policy to try and reconcile the legacy of apartheid and the legacy of colonialism that preceded it, inclusive of a regime called the color bar, which really in the 19th and early 20th centuries started to rationalize distinctions between different groups of people on the basis of phenotype, right? I don't think any of us believes that race really exists as an actual thing, but it's a very powerful concept. And so for decades, if not more than 100 and 150 years, South Africa had been organized into designated distinct groups. So in the mid to late 1990s, the new African National Congress-led government, leading in a tripartite alliance with the South African Communist Party and the Congress of South African Trade Unions, begins to imagine public policy that will intervene and disrupt this former way of organizing the society. And one way of thinking about that, amongst many, was to begin to use government funds, public monies, to restore infrastructure, whether it be housing, whether it be access to water, whether it be electrification. So basic services that would improve the fundamental living conditions of ordinary South Africans, particularly poor and Black South Africans, both in cities and in rural areas, by delivering things like housing. And so I felt that Cape Town was an interesting place to do this. And my first big monograph was really about the transition to delivering housing, to thinking about questions of land release, to enable people to lead dignified lives. Cape Town was peculiar because historically, though that particular region of South Africa had been ostensibly liberal, and I put that in big, big scare quotes, in practice, the way that segregation, separation of people into different areas of the city and across the country, but particularly in the city of Cape Town, had actually been implemented in very aggressive ways, in some respects much more aggressively than in other parts of the country. And so the city of Cape Town, after the transition to democracy, in many respects, looked far more segregated as an urban center. And the infrastructure for poor Black people was far more degraded than it was in other urban centers across the country. In the attempt to deliver housing in those first few years, maybe the first decade, there were very ambitious ideas about how much housing could be delivered, both in cities and in the countryside. Cape Town stood out for the fact that really, instead of there being improvement to basic services, to access to housing, mass transit, and so on, actually the city of Cape Town lagged behind. And I'll show an image a little bit later on of the conditions in which people, mostly poor Black people, continue to live across the country, but actually most especially in the city of Cape Town. And my hypothesis, if I actually had one as an anthropologist, I'm not sure that anthropologists have hypotheses, but to the degree I was predicting something, I felt that the scale of informal settlement, right? So human settlements where people were living in substandard housing, in informal structures, whether corrugated iron shacks or cardboard shacks or living in things equivalent to something like a tent with a tarpaulin, those areas were intended to be shrunk as a function of the delivery of housing, but in fact would proliferate. And that's exactly what's happened. So this is one of the key areas where I worry very much about the question of where race and class or socioeconomic status collide. Okay, so next slide. So the other way that South Africa chose to take rather a different path, and again, this is an iconic image, may be recognizable to you, with the appointment of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's featured on the right there, as Chief Commissioner of something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. South Africa determined, despite all of the historical injuries, all of the historical harms of the past 350 years, and particularly those during the apartheid years from 1948 to 1990, to go the path of reconciliation, of transformative justice. This was the opposite to the model of the Nuremberg trials after World War II and the end of the Holocaust, right? So to try and reconcile the different racial interests, the different class interests in the society, and instead to seek truth about what had occurred in the past, rather than going the route of finding truth and then engaging in punishment. In hindsight, I would argue that it was both a brave experiment, but also probably misdirected. One of the things that is very clear about apartheid and the colonial period before that is that so much of what harmed particularly poor Black South Africans, but really South Africans as a whole, were the forms of structural violence that made it so that the society was divided, so that the vast majority of people had limited opportunity, so that Black people were schooled precisely, exclusively for unskilled work, for the ways in which people lived deeply segregated and disparate lives. Those forms of harms, which were all motivated by racism, but also by a certain form of what I would call racial capitalism, were far greater than the tens of thousands of cases that came before the commission, framed by questions of human rights, narrowly understood as what has a perpetrator of gross human rights violations done to an individual, right? So the Truth Commission sought primarily to invite people to come forward. This was not a court of law, to come forward to speak the truth in instances where those individuals could demonstrate that they had either been harmed by another individual on political grounds, or that an individual should come forward and speak truth about how political imperatives, in other words, in the chain of command of the old government, had forced them into conducting things like abductions, detentions, interrogations, torture, and in many instances also disappearances and murder. So while all of that was extremely important, ultimately, I think in the grand scheme of things, fewer people were either exonerated than might have been, which is to say precisely because they didn't come forward, and fewer people were compensated for suffering than those who might have been compensated for if this had been framed as a question of structural violence over questions of gross human rights violations. And of course, there are still many, many questions about people who didn't come forward, about state secrets that have yet to be revealed. I have a colleague who is trained as a historian. She works with a great number, actually, of Brazilian and Argentine forensic anthropologists who have trained South Africans in forensic anthropology. And they continue the work of trawling 1980s cases of people who had disappeared. And I'm not sure precisely when that will end, but it's just to say that question is unresolved. So I think you're already hearing that I'm, in many respects, much more focused on questions of structural violence and ultimately the relationship between the very particular forms of racism that apartheid implemented and sustained, and the very particular form of capitalism, which I will call racial capitalism, that made it possible for the South African economy, for a time, to be incredibly profitable off the backs of poor Black people who were super exploited. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So this slide is, I think, probably the most important slide in this deck. The areas that you can see within the borders of South Africa, so in other words, the territory that appears in white, that is South Africa before 1994. And then within the white territory, the areas that come in shades of green, in shades of orange and yellow, of red, and so on. I think the first thing you'll note, so if you look to the key at the bottom, there are names for these territories which are color-coded, right? So one of the orange ones, excuse me, is Transkei. One of the mustard-colored ones is called Ciskei. Yellow one's called Kwakwa. The green one's Bophuthatswana, and so on. I think the very first thing to say is that any green territory is non-contiguous, right? It doesn't, all of the green territories are not all together. They are essentially scattered through the area of the northwest of the country. The orange areas that are Transkei are also scattered, etc., etc. I won't name the other places where one might see this kind of arrangement, but I think that this is fairly consistent with a number of settler colonial projects. One example would be in North America or in Canada, right? So these are strategies for organizing different kinds of people into small, non-contiguous areas. The non-contiguity is primarily because the white area of the map for the old South Africa is selectively all the places that are either mineral wealthy, specifically gold and diamonds, or arable land, so fertile land. And the primary question that remains for South Africans since 1994 and since the transition is really what South Africans refer to as the land question: how to redistribute land, which of course is also related to questions of housing and access to infrastructure, etc. So this map is really important to me. It's where I always start when I try and explain to people how completely insane the master plan for apartheid was. It was deeply spatial, it was deeply geographical. Those colored areas were supposed to accommodate 87% of the population of South Africa. The white area was supposed to accommodate 13% of the population, so primarily white and what South Africans used to refer to as colored. and that would include people of mixed race, it would include people of South Asian descent, it would include people who had previously been brought to South Africa in the 19th century as enslaved people from areas of the world like Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. But the percentages are reversed, which is to say that the areas that are green and orange and red and so on, housing 87% of the population, only make up 13% of the land. And the 87% of the land only accommodates 13% of the population, right? So it's this very perverse or paradoxical inversion of numbers and land mass. The final thing I'll say about these areas, which are referred to by South Africans as Bantustans, but also can be thought of as ethnic homelands, is that the ethnic homelands were color-coded by ethnicity or language grouping. So the green areas of Bophuthatswana are areas where people were Setswana speakers. The orange and mustard color areas were places where people in the Transkei and Ciskei were ethnically isiXhosa speakers, and so on, right? Today there are, well, now 12 official languages in South Africa, 2 of European extraction, so modified South African English, and also Afrikaans, which is influenced by Dutch to some degree, Huguenot French and German. And then there are 9 African languages, and now South Africa has just adopted South African Sign Language. So there are now 12 official languages in South Africa. But it's this map that is absolutely integral to what South Africa becomes and the legacy that since 1994, South African government has been attempting to address. And I would simply shorthand that by saying part of it is land and the other is labor, and that all settler colonial projects are always about those 2 things, right? Finally, just to say that during the decade of the 1950s, so following the adoption of apartheid in 1948, the apartheid government first attempts to empty the white areas of the map through forced deportations or forced removals into the green and the red and the black and the orange and all of that, those areas, by ethnicity, by language grouping. And then to draw on those areas to bring people back into the white portion of the map, which would come to be known as metropolitan or urban South Africa, for purposes of fueling South Africa's post-World War II industrial boom. One of the things that distinguishes South Africa from many other countries in the southern region, and more generally sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, is that South Africa is the only country that experiences an industrial revolution as a function of the discovery of gold and diamonds in the mid to late 19th century. So all of this geographic spatial arrangement is about land and labor arbitrage, about managing a surplus population, a reserve army of labor, by bringing people back and forth. This is to say, primarily young Black men on contract into the white portions of the region to work in the mines, to work in manufacturing, and on the borderlands with those areas that are orange and yellow, et cetera, to work in large-scale agriculture, in industrial agriculture. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So I guess I've probably already really synopsized this. But okay, so colonial regimes rely on land grab and labor exploitation. I don't think that that's a surprise. I'm sure there's a comparison for Mexico, and I'd love to hear what that might be. But the legacy is the following, and I have these 5 bullet points. So one is that South Africa today is the most unequal major economy globally, as measured by Gini coefficient. Now, that doesn't mean it's the most unequal society, but it means, for example, that Namibia, which is to the north and west of South Africa, is probably the most unequal society. But it's a very, very small economy. So the issue here is South Africa is the most unequal major economy globally, major economy. Its Gini coefficient is moving towards 1. I think it's 0.67. So if you hit 1, you know, that would be extremely unequal. More than 50% of the national population lives below the upper bound poverty line. And of course, those are primarily Black people. It's also interesting to say that for all the errors that South African government has committed since 1994, one of which I would argue is turning to a neoliberal model for the economy, that at one and the same time, South Africa, of all developing or middle income countries, probably has the largest apparatus of social assistance of any country in that income band. So something like 55% of all South Africans depend on multiple forms of social assistance for health, for schooling, just for bare necessities. There are many different kinds of grants, social grants delivered to women with dependent children, to people with disabilities, etc., etc. So it's a very, very large apparatus of social assistance. So at the same time, as a legacy of the map from the prior slide, a very small minority owns a disproportionate amount of land and capital. As illustration, the 2017 land audit, and that is the latest one that we have, they really need to do another one, notes that white South Africans own 72% of farm and agricultural holdings. As of the 2022 census, whites accounted for a mere 7.3% of the national population. So this is a radical, radical disjuncture, right, between land ownership and racial representation. And I would just add, this is in stark contrast to the Trump administration's representation of white farmers as victims of land dispossession in need of asylum in the US, which has been in the news back and forth the last several weeks. Okay, next slide. Okay, so one of the things that has happened as a consequence of South Africa's embrace of a neoliberal pathway is, in fact, shockingly low or zero growth. And I don't want to get into...
Hola, ¿cómo estás, Tati? Bien. ¿Sí?
Sorry,
que fue-
sorry,
fue
but you
por un
can go
café.
on. I'll try to. Okay, Don,
Okay.
go on, please. Sorry.
No, it's fine. So I don't want to go down the path of behaving like an economist, but I just want to show you this graph to say that the decision to go down the path of neoliberalism, which I think is probably familiar to everybody in this webinar, is some parts external pressure, right, in the early 1990s, in the lead up to South Africa's transition to adopt World Bank, International Monetary Fund policy. So there was a lot of supranational pressure to go down this path. But part of it has to do with something, in my view, that's more interesting and perhaps goes to some of the things that you were reading before this webinar, which is South Africa's negotiation with itself in the liberation organizations over many decades before the 90s about its vision of what it hoped South Africa would be on the other side of liberation. It's telling to me that in 1994, when all South Africans went to the polls, cast their ballots for the first time in its history, that the language of liberation had disappeared, or of decolonization, or of gaining independence, and I think semantics really matter. That rather than saying South Africa was transitioning away from apartheid through liberation to independence, the language that seemed to have to be adopted was a language of a transition to democracy, which signals to me something about the era, right? It's only 5 years before that you have the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And then in the early 90s, the ultimate dissolution of the former Soviet Union. The things that liberation fighters, liberation intellectuals, liberation architects of what people hoped would be an optimistic future, the debates that people like that had in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, until apartheid collapsed, were about what kind of society a free society would look like. And many of those debates, as I've written elsewhere, were about holding on to the idea of race and class together. And most famously, in the work of Neville Alexander, who I read a great deal and who I'm a great admirer of, Neville Alexander was, I would say, a liberation architect. He was an intellectual. He was a theorist of apartheid, of colonialism, of imperialism. Famously argued that in South Africa, racial domination was indistinguishable from the relationship of capital and labor. In other words, there was no way to imagine an independent, a decolonized, a liberated South Africa without attending to the question of the regime of capital that operated in South Africa, which he referred to as racial capitalism. He and a number of other thinkers of this ilk in South Africa in the 60s and 70s were the very first people to coin the term racial capitalism, which certainly in the United States has now become a very popular term. There's a veritable cottage industry in particularly Black studies around the question of racial capitalism, its relationship to histories of enslavement, chattel slavery, plantation economies, and so on. But none of those American-based scholars actually attribute Neville Alexander and the thinkers with whom he worked for the fact that South Africa was ultimately the most acute, exaggerated example of a system of racial capitalism in which race and class couldn't be disentangled from one another. And of course, what Neville Alexander hoped for was that those who were the guardians of the transition to an independent South Africa would be attentive both to desegregation, getting rid of white supremacy, attending to the various forms of reparation that would be important for improving Black life, but also that they would attend to the form in which capitalism appeared in South Africa that was so incredibly super exploitative of Black people in particular. So one of his collaborators, and this is one of my all-time favorite quotes, one of Neville Alexander's collaborators, somebody called Harold Wolpe, also a decolonial thinker, somebody who was trying to imagine what South Africa would look like after the end of the system of apartheid, was very clear also about this relationship between race and class. And I'll quote him, and he says, for the time from 1948 until the end of apartheid, that racist ideology in South Africa, policy, and the state, while appearing as the means for the reproduction of segregation, in other words, that racist ideology, all it did was reproduce segregation and discrimination, also was something else, the means for the reproduction of a particular mode of production. In other words, racism was absolutely integral to the way that capitalism operated in South Africa. Okay, next slide. So what we have instead is this. So I was saying earlier, I would get to this slide. These are the living conditions in which many, many, many Black South Africans live today. This is actually a picture from my old field site in Cape Town to the southeast of the Central Business District in an area called Philippi, where I did years of ethnographic research. And you'll see in the foreground, so this is what I was talking about when I said people are living in shacks made out of corrugated iron. To the left of that one central structure, there are 1, 2, 3, there's a bank of pit latrines, right? These are makeshift toilets. So there's been a real slowing of the implementation of housing delivery and basic infrastructure. Also, at one and the same time, a massification of demand for housing provision and basic infrastructure as people have moved from those areas on that map, the yellow, the orange, the green, etc., into cities in search of employment. But because South Africa's economy prior to 1994 relied on the removal of surplus labor, of surplus populations to those tiny little fragments of non-contiguous territory, in a sense, thereby concealing the fact that the South African economy relied deeply on mass unemployment. With the arrival of people into cities looking for work where there is no work because the structure of the economy hasn't articulated with the new conditions. And under neoliberalism, the focus is on things like investment banking, real estate, insurance, as well as mining and energy. There are no opportunities for people coming out of a system that intensively and intently de-skilled and miseducated young Black people. There's a crisis in the university system because of massification of the universities, right? Universities that primarily catered to a white middle class now are supposed to, and quite rightly, supposed to cater to a massified population of young Black people who may or may not be fully prepared for higher education. There are also young Black people who may have one of those 9 African languages as their first language, and most higher education institutions operate in English medium and Afrikaans medium. So you can see what the problem is. So the slide I just showed you previously with the zero growth is jobless growth, right? There have been really no jobs added to the economy since the mid to late 1990s. And alongside South Africa's deep, deep inequality, you have mass joblessness. So conservatively estimated, South Africa's unemployment is close to 40%. Okay, next slide. I think I'm almost done here. So this is just to give you a sense of the priorities in the country. And I'll end after this one slide, I think. So back in August of 2024, it becomes clear to the authorities, to the mining industry, that a number of now shuttered gold mines, I think also a platinum mine, have been taken over by what I would call artisanal miners but really they're just small-scale independent miners, many of whom are people who previously worked for the mines before those mines were closed, and who've now come back informally to mine the dregs of gold silt, of platinum silt, and so on. The South African government, the authorities, determined that this is illegal activity. So they're not addressing the structural problems, why people would go back into very dangerous working conditions without the support of a formal mining house with formal mining infrastructure and technology. And so by the end of 2024, it's reported that there are probably as many as 400 or 500 miners down in one of these previously shuttered mines. And they are there to try and make income as they can, artisanally, informally, precisely because of the closure of mines, shifts in the political economy of South Africa as a function of neoliberalism. And the state's determination is to criminalize what is taking place and to block access out of the mine. And this story carries on into mid-January of 2025. So by this time, there's been months of siege, and the South African authorities finally determine, led by the Department of Mineral Resources, that they actually have to send crews down into these mine shafts to rescue people who have started dying. They're starving. Some of them are asking for supplies of antiretroviral drugs because many of them are HIV positive and so on. I just give this as an example, which I think brings class and race together in a very poignant way, alongside the dominance of a particular industry, namely mining, which is now actually in decline in South Africa. It tells us a lot about the priorities of a state that on one hand speaks the language of truth and reconciliation, speaks the language of reconstruction and development, speaks the language of social assistance, and at the same time is very much vulnerable to global markets, to decreases in the prices of certain commodities, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll just leave it with this one final slide, Jimena, if you can just go one further on. This is an image of the beginning of an attempt to rafts and start pulling people out. And by the time they were done, they had pulled up, I'm very sorry to say, I think it was about 90 bodies. Other people were on the verge of starvation, and then everyone was arrested, right? So I know the question in this workshop is about the nature of racism. Well, one could say that this kind of view of race, of class, of historic, the legacy of the old system expressed through something like the interests of a mining company really tells you everything you need to know about the status of race and racism in South Africa. This is a Black majority government, albeit governing in a government of national unity with the other dominant party, which is the Democratic Alliance, which is the party of actually white business interest, right, in the spirit of being conciliatory and having reconciliation in South Africa. But there are certain things about bottom line, about a system of capital that prioritizes profit over people, shareholders over stakeholders, that makes it so that even a Black majority government at times, actually quite often, will operate and function in ways that appear to be anti-Black racist. So I'll just end there, and I am very eager to hear what kind of conversation we might have. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Very interesting. I know that there's going to be a lot of questions. So Jimena, if you want to
Yes, I just want you to check, and Maria, if you want to listen the questions in English, please go to the menu in the
Yep.
lower part of the Zoom and pick English. So this may be work better for this part of the seminar. So,
Got it.
ahora voy a hablar en español. ¿Está bien? Okay.
I mean, I just heard you speak in English. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ok, perfecto. Entonces yo voy a hablar en español. Y pues nada, agradecer muchísimo por la presentación. En efecto, fue sumamente interesante. No sé si Olivia o Cristina quisieran comentar algo antes de pasar a sus preguntas, que pues pueden levantar la mano, pueden preguntar en español, pueden preguntar en inglés. Tratemos de hablar lento nada más y también podemos leerlas del chat aquí y en YouTube. Entonces, ustedes me dicen.
Bueno, I will speak in English for you, but it's going to be translated. I don't know in which language to put my head. Well, thank you very, very much for this really great explanation between the history, the history of capitalism and the history of racism, and as you said, racial capitalism. I think it was really very clear, for us, it's a whole class, on the subject, very, very clear and simple, which I really am grateful for. I wanted to just to open the dialogue, ask you, you told us that you told us in the emails that you would maybe talk about the agrarian reform as an anti-racist policy, but also as a persistent racist, mirror of racism. So that I think is very interesting. If you could talk about that. And another thing, I'm sorry, and another thing is that in your article, you talk about something that I found really fascinating and that I would love you to develop a little bit, that you talked about credit or apartheid, no? And if I understood well, what you're saying is that most of the poor population in South Africa, correct me if I'm wrong, but which is the Black population mainly, lives on this very developed system of debts, no? Credit debts, and that they cannot just get liberated from that, and that it has become what you call a credit apartheid. So that I think is for me very interesting. If you could develop that. And in the introduction of the book, Adebanwi, I don't know, says that, well, something that for us maybe is similar but not similar, that that Africa is a continent where all the extremes, you find all the extremes, no? All the abundance of resources, natural resources, and the extreme poverty, the extreme consumism, but also the extreme impoverishment, no? And that the economical crisis that have existed in Africa recently, in the last decades, the political instability and the social paralysis, what he calls social paralysis, I would love you to give us your opinion on that in South Africa, have created a eradication of what he calls the middle ground between happiness and misery. human happiness and misery. So I think I read some of the articles and they all speak about that. And so I wanted to develop this a little bit. Thank you very much.
Sure. So maybe I can talk about the land question first.
Yes.
And it is actually called the land question. And, you know, when I've gone back and read some of these statements, documents, manifestos, charters from the really dark days of apartheid, including the 1955 Freedom Charter, which is so interesting because 1955 is also the Bandung Conference. But of course, South Africans, certainly Black South Africans, were not able to travel at that time. They were really trapped in South Africa. But in the mid-50s, I think, because of the timing of decolonization going on in the African continent generally, and because of the post-World War II compact with the Declaration of Universal Human Rights and so on, people in the Southern Hemisphere were organizing in very particular ways. And so the language of things like liberation, of decolonization, of non-alignment with what was emerging as the Cold War, this really fueled in South Africa ideas about, yeah, what would happen if South Africa could ever liberate itself. And always at the center of every imagining, every statement was the so-called land question. Because by the mid-1950s, that map I showed you was really being consolidated and people were being dispossessed, they were being moved. There was even some crazy plan, which is so resonant with what's going on at the moment in the world, to declare those tiny little non-contiguous territories independent sovereign nations. And the world, of course, turned around and said, "You're crazy. We will never recognize these territories. We know what you're doing." But all to say that there was a recognition within the many anti-apartheid organizations, and of course, Nelson Mandela's African National Congress is only the most famous. There were many others. At times they collaborated, at times they competed. But all of them recognized the critical nature of being able to reclaim land for people to sustain themselves if and when apartheid ended. So one of the things you see in South Africa, which is actually linked in some ways to your second question about debt, when you see people, say, selling fruit or vegetables on the side of the road, whether in the city or the countryside, they are not selling things that they have grown. They are not selling things that other people like them have grown. They are selling things that they have purchased from a wholesaler, which also supplies national chains of supermarkets, because Black South Africans generally don't have access to land. So this is the problem, that there is no way for your ordinary Black South African with no money in the bank, without much education, to sustain themselves, and better still, to make a real livelihood, because they have no access to land. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that government actually owns quite a lot of land, some of which might be releasable to ordinary people. During the late 90s and early 2000s, the South African government set up something called a land commission. And the idea was that people could come forward and they could submit a land claim. Now, of course, based on their ability to prove that they had been dispossessed of land during a set historical period. The first problem with that was the historical period in question. Government determined probably for purposes of not scaring off white business and white capital, to delineate from 1913, the year of the so-called Native Land Act, when South Africans of color were legislated against, and from 1913 no longer permitted to own private property, to 1994. But of course, colonial land grab had been taking place since 1652. So it was a very narrow remit, and it was also very narrow in the sense of the time period afforded people to submit a claim. I think the Land Commission opened in maybe 95 or 96, and then closed in the early 2000s. So there may have been a 5-year period. The Land Commission then went on to say, we've been 95% successful because we have settled, I don't know, several tens of thousands of land claims. But of course, that was a drop in the bucket. That was nothing compared to the immense number of land claims that might have been put forward if the time frame had been from 1652. The minute the Dutch got off that boat in what would later become the city of Cape Town, they started land grabbing. It's what we call in South Africa now original violence. You know, so that is the issue. And what has happened in the last several years have been many conversations about expropriation without compensation. The model has been willing buyer, willing seller at market rate, in which the government will intercede to negotiate on the side of both parties. That, to your specific question, has eventuated in the transfer of land, not to individuals, but to communities, which, you know, I'm not necessarily in favor of private property relations at all, but if you're going to go down that road, you should be relaying private property to individuals on the basis of individual claims. These relaying of transfers of property to communities has created standstills, where then the community spends the next 10, 15, 20 years trying to sort out who has the right to do what on that land. It also, to me, seems in some ways perversely racist to assume that white property owners are individuals, recognizable under the law, and that Black people are just collectivities, right? It doesn't make any sense to me. So many of the land claims have completely stalled in the sense that, yeah, people have been handed over land, and then for 25 years, there's no agreement about how, when, what, anyone can use the land. And then people are caught up in the courts. So this is one of the issues. And then finally, in the last 25 years, there has actually been corporate consolidation of land ownership. So fewer people have ended up owning more land. So you have these, you know, contradictory pull-push tensions between the stated aims of the law, which are redistributive, the fact of an economy given over to the regime of private property, and these tiny little efforts at redistribution. Okay. So that, you know, makes for a situation in which people can't sustain themselves. They become indebted. And the other side of the economy is a kind of immaterial capital, right? What I would call fictitious capital formation. South Africa really has an overrepresentation of banking and finance, at times as much as 1/5 of GDP. And that doesn't employ anybody. Algorithms do the work of trading, not people, right? You don't need anybody to run an investment bank, not really. And yet you've got almost 40% unemployment with people who are not skilled to work in those particular sectors of the economy. The final thing I'll say is that there has been a big push since the mid-1990s since democratization to democratize banking. And it goes by this thing I mentioned in that article about banking the unbanked, financial inclusion, but a lot of it has been extremely predatory, right? Encouraging people who are in the informal economy to place their cash in a bank account. But those bank accounts have very, very low ceilings and very, very high fees. And in this way, poor people are extracted from. And this is how they get into debt. So that's how I would answer those questions. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Then I'm going to read a question in the chat. It's from Yolanda Moses.
Mhm.
And she says, thank you so much for this very important presentation. Can you say something about the role of gender in the racial capitalist system? Are women faring any better than men? What role does patriarchy plays in this system?
Right.
Can you comment a little bit? It's a very huge question, but comment a little bit on this topic, please.
But it's a classic question. So going back to that map, I think I said that the primary types of people who ended up in formal work under the old system when that map was still operating were largely young Black men who left the orange and the mustard and the green and the yellow territories and went back into the Republic of South Africa, where they worked in mining, manufacturing, and industrial agriculture. So the whole economy during the apartheid years and even before that was dependent on migrant labor. And usually formal employers arranged contracts, mostly yearly contracts, sometimes 2 years at a time. And at the end of those contracts, those men were sent back to those discontinuous territories. Meantime, what was going on in those discontinuous territories was that women, of course, right, poor Black women, were essentially sewing up the gap between what the state ought to be providing in the way of a social wage, so forms of social assistance, what employers ought to have been paying but were not because migrant labor was super exploited. And so it was Black women who were essentially keeping families going with what I call spit and sticky tape, suturing together lives, looking after elderly people in those discontinuous territories where there really was no healthcare to speak of, no hospitals, no clinics, suturing together things like childcare, particularly grandmothers actually looking after grandchildren, and doing all of the social assistance work that in a more normal situation would be the burden both of industry and the state, right, through adequate wages and through a social wage or social assistance, which is part of the reason the contemporary South African government has been so clear, despite being a neoliberal state that's very schizophrenic, about providing social assistance as well. So women play an enormously important role and a very difficult role under the old system. At a certain point, women just say, well, damn, we can't be relegated to these non-contiguous territories, to the Bantustans. And we will also have to go into the so-called Republic of South Africa in search of work. This was mostly illegal because South Africa had a pass system, a little bit like a passbook, for showing the authorities what ethnicity, what language group you were, who your employer was, where you had permission to live. And if you didn't have those, you weren't supposed to be in the Republic of South Africa. part of my original project on informal settlements and shanty towns in Cape Town was to follow the histories of women who determined they would prefer to be with their families, their children, their partners. And I make no specific, how to say, generalization about what kinds of arrangements these were, based on sexual orientation, based on formal marriage arrangements, whatever it was that people considered households. Many women determined by the late 70s and early 1980s that they would refuse to continue to be banished to the Bantustans. And they started coming into South Africa, the Republic, and in fact were oftentimes the people who established shanty towns so they could live with their male partners or whoever their partners were, because, sorry, that's my dog, because the mining companies, the manufacturing companies had historically provided single-sex housing to male migrants to keep them contained, to socially control them, and so on. So women play a historically incredibly important role. The challenge presently is the absence of employment, which is persistent and extreme. And I think you ask about patriarchy. Well, you know, it's so predictable, but in societies that historically have suffered enormous forms of structural violence, but also interpersonal violence. And South Africa has extremely high levels of what are referred to as intimate crimes and contact crime. Women are very much on the receiving end of that. And there's a real question, I think, there about how we theorize the relationship between, let's say, original violence like land grab, structural violence like segregation and the Bantustans, and then the forms of violence meted out by the apartheid state through things like abductions, detentions, terror, right? Interrogation, torture, and so on. I think all of those are linked to one another. Yeah. But thank you for the question. Yeah. Looks like Christina has a question, and then there's another one in the chat.
Okay. Chris.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have actually two questions. One that I received by email from Heriberto Avelino. He's asking, he says, I always had a question whether after 30 years since the end of apartheid, there are any traces of racism in the everyday life and the public policies. So it's an interesting question, I think, and a little bit general question about racism in everyday life, but also in public policies. I think you already gave us a lot of information about the consequences of racism in economic inequalities, in health also, and in labor or work. And I was also going to ask something about gender, so I was really thankful that Yolanda already asked that. And the other question I had is about education. If in the in education, is there an anti-racist content, or do you think there is also the reproduction of this racism? And I don't know if Jimena wants to read the one that Noemi.
I think it's a slightly different topic, so maybe we can hear Anne Maria first.
Okay, so I think maybe I've answered the question about, let's say, anti-Black racism in public policy, which is to say, to me, it often feels a combination of not necessarily intentional, but the path dependency is already there, that all policies seem to be geared to the interests of middle class interests, moneyed interests, and so on. And while there is an emerging middle class, and there is certainly a small but very powerful financial elite, which is Black. And that financial elite has emerged as a consequence of policies that were designed to create a middle class, but ultimately ended up creating this very powerful Black capitalist class instead. And then there was an adjustment, and government said, no, 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 we've got to make this broad-based. We want to encourage things like small businesses, small and medium-sized businesses that are Black owned. We want to encourage the education of people who will go into teaching and nursing and these sorts of things. But in certain respects, we're still looking at a first or maybe just the beginning of a second generation of people who are in that middle section. And of course, middle is so hard to define. What actually is middle? You know, studying middle classness is like moving goalposts. So, and then there are blind spots when it comes to things like social assistance, where public policies that are supposed to be designed for poverty alleviation don't alleviate poverty. They simply keep people on a treadmill, you know, just slightly above the point of complete and utter crisis, if that. One of the interesting things I always observe when I'm in South Africa, and I go annually, especially in the city of Cape Town, which on the face of it appears to be a white city with poor Black people living so far out that they are almost invisible. Johannesburg, by contrast, is absolutely a Black urban environment, and you have Black people of every class, status, and it's very vibrant, and there's an interesting Black cultural scene. There are Black institutions, right? Cape Town is really suffering the legacy of all the things I described. To me, in Cape Town, it is those everyday little gestures that tell you so much about ongoing, daily, routine racism. And it's very often in the employer-employee relationship, in the way that white business owners don't trust their Black employees. And so everything is slowed down by the mistrust. I've always said I'd love to do a project where I was able to be a consultant who did ethnography of workplace and workflows, and just point out that actually, you know what, your Black employees know what they're doing because they do it every day. You just won't let them make any decisions, you know. So it's in those things, but also in forms of brutality. I had thought to send on a link to the work of Sisonke Nsimang. I'm going to put it in the chat. She's a Black South African journalist who publishes from time to time in something called Africa is a Country, which of course is an irony. She doesn't really mean that. And she recently published a piece about two farmhands on a farm, and farms are very difficult labor environments for Black people because they are hidden from view, they are in remote areas. She wrote this piece about an infamous case of two farmhands who were buried alive by the bosses, and as a joke, right? And what that told us about the hostilities between, well, rather the hostility of white people to Black people in South Africa. And then she goes on to rename the, you know, the controversies that have been ongoing between the US and South Africa recently, and to say, rather than imagining that white farmers are losing their land and they need the protection of asylum to the US. Here's what's actually going on. You know, those are some of the day-to-day hostilities, and of course they are passed on through families intergenerationally. Okay, so that was one set of questions. Then the other question was about, Christina, was it about gender as well?
No, it was about education.
Education, yeah. So 10 years ago, all 26 public universities in South Africa shut down because students shut them down. And it went by two hashtags, fees must fall and Rhodes must fall. Rhodes being Cecil Rhodes, who was the great colonizer and really established Anglo-American, the mining house, and eventually went on to give his fortune to, or some of it, to Oxford, hence the Rhodes scholarships, right, at Oxford University. At the University of Cape Town, which really set the whole thing in motion, there has long been a Cecil Rhodes statue in the center of campus, and the land grant for the university was granted by Cecil Rhodes. And Black students who by 2015, 2016 were being admitted fairly regularly to the University of Cape Town had a number of complaints about their treatment at the hands of white faculty and administration, about the nature of their curriculum that wasn't sufficiently decolonized, the fact of English medium education, the feeling around the campus of this being a white institution that hadn't really transformed. And also, quite critically, that given the long-standing rule of what's called 40-40, 40 kilometers out of town, 40 minutes away from town, meaning the policies of segregation that meant that Black people lived very far from the centers of business and education and so on, that many Black students who were now in this incredibly rarefied, privileged environment were nevertheless still living in the shanty towns like that image I showed you. A young man called Makwele decided that he was fed up. And of course, it never only takes one person, it takes many people, but he was the trigger. He brought to school, to campus, from Khayelitsha, where he lived, which is about 45, 50 minutes, if not an hour out of town. He brought to university a bucket of feces from the pit latrine, right? Remember that picture? From the pit latrine in the area of his community, and tipped it over the statue of Cecil Rhodes. And this set in motion a series of events which ultimately culminated in the removal of the statue. Very interestingly, in the same year that in the United States, there were many debates about monuments to the Confederacy and whether those should be removed, some of which were removed. And that sparked something that then spread from university to university, eventually to the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, where people were much more radical and they were thinking about things like solidarity with workers and getting rid of outsourcing and insourcing contracts and so on. But the key issue really was, we are poor, we are Black, we don't have access to education because we don't have the fees to pay for registration, right? So many people had grants, many people had scholarships, but even to register, you needed really in dollars, say $100, not very much money, to register in order to qualify for your tuition waiver, your scholarship, or your grant. And those students came out en masse, beginning in March of 2015, and then by October, the universities across the country were closed. And what they were really responding to was, on one hand, again, South Africa is schizophrenic. Massification of registration of Black students their admission into the university system for purposes of educating them, upskilling them, enabling them to be competitive in the job market. And then at one and the same time, not affording environments where people felt comfortable because the universities themselves hadn't transformed. And that massification set this whole thing in motion. So that's really my answer. It was an extraordinary period of time. Many people, unfortunately, were deregistered from the university, were not permitted to complete their degrees, weren't able to graduate. Eventually, of course, the movement was exhausted. But year on year, come the beginning of the academic year, at the moment of registration, when people need those fees, we have some of the same things happening, the same protests, the attempts to speak to administration, those kinds of things. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anne Maria. Well, I'm going to read the question in the chat, but I want to ask some context to it. Noemi is asking, I'm sorry, let me. Okay. I understand that the situation in the Congo is very different, but I wanted to know if you think this system of racist capitalism is reproduced in mining issues in general, I guess, and the similarities between both situations. I was reading last year Nancy Fraser's Cannibal Capitalism, and I want to say it was very revealing to me about the intersections of capitalism, racism, patriarchy, etc. And so she asked herself the question if it's possible to have a non-racist capitalism. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the possibilities or the needs of anti-racism in the context of neoliberalism? In this moment, because it's a very broad, huge topic, and I want you to have your opinion about the needs of what kind of anti-racism do we need in this context.
Yeah, well,
Clear? Yes? No?
yeah, no, that's fine. So I guess one of the things one has to make a distinction about is that race is not phenotypy, right? Not the way that people look. And that actually most people who are thinking about capitalism as racial capitalism are thinking about processes of racialization, right? Of making people different from one another, regardless of phenotypy, right? And there are a lot of debates amongst some of the foundational thinkers in the field of racial capitalism, certainly as then gets taken up by mostly US-based scholars. So, the last probably 10 years, a lot of people have picked up Robinson's Black Marxism, again, which was originally published in 1983. At the time, nobody read it, which is very interesting because the 80s is the era of Thatcher and Reagan, and I think the book just didn't land. Then it's republished in 2000, and all of a sudden there's this uptick of interest in Black Marxism. He, of course, is making very complicated arguments across, I think, about 700 pages about the rise of capitalism in the transition from feudalism to something else in early modern Europe. And he's interested in the first instance in the forms of difference. You could call them processes of racialization, of making Europeans different from one another, right? So in the historical period of feudalism, it would have been, well, serfs versus the feudal lord, right? So a kind of hierarchical difference. For the period of the emergence of the Atlantic world, right? So when Europeans are going out with naval power and naval technologies, and heading to places like Caribbean, right? And establishing plantation economies. Some of what happens during that historical period, which I suppose you could say is defined by the 16th century, is in fact the bringing of white European indentured labor to the New World, before thinking about African enslaved labor. And so Robinson's trying to think through, right, is this actually about race, or is this about racialization? And there are many examples of forms of differentiation on which early capitalism relies before we get to the question of chattel slavery, of the uses of West Africans and other people of color for that purpose. So that's one set of questions. Then you get somebody like Eric Williams, who interestingly is the first prime minister of an independent Trinidad, and starts out as quite a radical, right? He's writing thesis at Oxford, poor thing, in the 1930s with a highly unsympathetic dissertation committee, all of whom have colonial interests in British Empire, right? Somehow passes for the brilliance of what he wrote, even though politically people disagreed with him. He writes a book thereafter, thin little book, called Capitalism and Slavery, which interestingly, just like Black Marxism, goes out of fashion for a while, and then most recently was republished with a foreword or an introduction by a colleague of mine at Duke University. Eric Williams is making sort of a similar argument, which is that if you look at the rationalization, the reasons, the political motivations for abolition in the 19th century, abolition of the slave trade, so abolition in Britain in particular, this isn't because people care about Black people at all. It's because the slave trade has become unprofitable, right? So it's to say that trying to figure out the relationship between anti-Black racism and capitalism is a very complicated thing. Racialization is another matter, right? And that could include all sorts of people. But certainly the outcome on the other end, the consequence, seems to be the ability of capitalism to create forms of difference, some of which are quite predominant now, anti-Black and so on. But that at one and the same time, capitalism depends on differentiation for its own purposes. You know, in the example of the Congo, it's actually not so different. I'm sure there's a good Spanish translation of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, right? And it's an extraordinary text. It's also very, in certain respects, problematic text. But it's very clear that whether from the perspective of Joseph Conrad or the cat who he's using as a mouthpiece, right, Marlowe. And Marlowe is ambivalent and ambiguous as a second-person narrator. That Black people, Congolese in that story, are essentially disposable to the project of the extraction of ivory for the enrichment of the well, not even Belgian, but basically King Leopold, right, King of the Belgians. So yeah, I mean, to the extent that capitalism is always predatory, and to the extent it always relies on differentiation, put those two things together, and I think you probably have your answer. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Maybe we have time for a last intervention, so I'll
Yeah.
give the word to Olivia. And if anyone else have any question, you can leave it in the chat, and maybe we can send it to Anne Maria or something like that. Thank you so much.
Yes, I had two questions. One is, what is the anti-racist movement in South Africa saying? I mean, what are their main subjects? What do they want? How do they go about it? That was one question. And the other question is that I heard in a thesis exam, well, a dissertation exam, that in South Africa, because of this regime that you so well described about ethnic separation, no, I mean linguistic, for example, separation, the languages have survived in a very strong way, but it has come with a very, very high cost, which is all this that you described. I mean, I won't repeat. Of the separation and of the impossibility of people to go to other parts of the country and all that. And it's very interesting for us, I think, in Mexico, because Mexico has had assimilationist racism, not at all segregationist, not at all apartheid, not at all that kind of racism. But in this context, indigenous languages are fighting like mad to survive, because assimilation has been less cruel, yes, in many, many ways. But at the same time, the message is you must stop being what you are. You have to assimilate. So I want to ask you these two things. Yeah.
So, I mean, organizing is so complicated. And I guess we're talking about progressive organizing, right? So, and oftentimes people have to create a big tent with many, many different issues in that big tent, and not necessarily agree with one another on all things, which is very hard, right? So that's in a way tactical to do that, to be all-encompassing. And I don't want to overplay the role of Black women, but I have to say that as in many, many environments, and Black women have really been leaders. Now, whether they get listened to is another matter. But during the 2015-2016 student uprisings in South Africa, it was certainly at the beginning, Black queer women were leading the charge. And into a very particular version of patriarchy, South African patriarchy, that made it difficult. And ultimately, there were certain male student leaders who took over. But if one is talking about people who are setting an example, and who do set an example in many, many different organizing spaces for very many different reasons, it tends to be Black women. I was recently in South Africa. I took some business students with me after teaching a course. They went for a travel experience. And one of the most startling and most revealing presentations we sat through was with a former advisee of mine, who is now a parliamentary economist who works in the budget office in Parliament in Cape Town. And she is quite clear that her white papers are all Black radical feminist economics. Now, of course, it so happens that South Africa is a particular kind of environment where you might be able to get away with that. But she is literally trying to make the argument, while the government of national unity, which is now in disunity, tries to come to an agreement about a budget, that the only way they are going to succeed with poverty alleviation is if they take very seriously a radical feminist economics, because women are stitching the whole thing together for everybody. in the kinds of organizing circles that I wouldn't say I'm a part of, but I have the privilege of sometimes being a witness to in the social housing space and so on. Yeah, I mean, people come together with very many different agendas, but there's a sense in which South Africans are only 30 years away from the equivalent of a civil war and something that was settled through grassroots organizing. They still have a repertoire of how to de-escalate conflict, to be brave in their protest in the housing space, social housing space, by literally seizing buildings that are unoccupied and then just going and living in them. These kinds of things. And a deep awareness of unevennesses of status, of hierarchy. One of the things that I think is incredibly heartening about South Africa is, unlike many parts of the world, the thing that people just don't seem to care too much about are religious differences. There's just really not much, you know, there's a kind of ecumenism. And in a place like Cape Town, which is not predominantly, but significantly Muslim and significantly Jewish, Christian, and many other things, this is just really not where people have conflict. So I guess that's how I'd answer that question. And answer your other question about language. The interesting thing about Black South Africans, including in my own family, is that most Black South Africans speak all 9 African languages with varying degrees of, you know, none of us speak all languages the same way, right? So the competencies are uneven. But there's definitely mutual intelligibility, especially in urban areas like Johannesburg. If you think back to that slide about the incident with the mine at Stilfontein, the way that people historically have collaborated in dangerous work conditions like the mines is by mutual intelligibility. So that's one answer to the question. The other answer, unfortunately, is that there is a battle in government presently to advance a bill around language to facilitate the right of minority language speakers to learn in their first language, which the white right wing has taken up as a defense of Afrikaans, which is not what the bill was supposed to be about at all. And there is now a lot of contention about, well, we're just going to attempt to pass this bill in order to enforce the instruction of Afrikaans in schools, and people are just not having it. But the final thing I'll say is, of course, there is a degree to which languages don't have the same status. And when it comes to business and when it comes to government, primarily English and Afrikaans are still dominant. And so it's not an assimilationist project like the one you're describing, but in practice, it ends up being sort of an assimilationist project because Black people have to be fluent in English and Afrikaans. Yeah.
Well, Anne-Marie, thank you so much. I think we will have to say goodbye because our translators have to go. But Jimena and Cristina, if you want to say the final words and also announce our next session. Yes. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Maria. It was really, really interesting to have all this information about South Africa. We have to still learn a lot about it, and thank you very much. It has been a real honor to have you and to have all of the people that are here with us, and also to have Yolanda Moses. Thank you.
I hope we can find other spaces to still like collaborate and keep this conversation alive. I think it's very important to have these broad references about the topic that worries us very much, and everyone here, I'm sure. So thank you very much for your perspective and also for the participation of everyone, the translation, the transmission, everything. Everyone makes this seminar possible. This is our 76th session.
Wow.
Oh, yes.
56.
56, 56.
56. Well, still.
Wow.
So thank you for making part of this seminar. So yes, about the next session, I'll say in English and then Spanish. It's going to be about anti-racism in Latin America with Mónica Moreno y Carlos Agudelo next month on
22, May 22nd.
May 22nd. If you want to join us, Anne-Marie, you're always welcome. La próxima sesión es el jueves 22 de mayo. Vamos a hablar de antirracismos en América Latina con Carlos Agudelo y Mónica Moreno. Entonces, pues esperamos verles aquí, en este espacio que es suyo. Y pues muchas gracias, como siempre. Nos vemos a la próxima sesión.
Sí, muchísimas gracias también a todas las personas que nos han acompañado en esta sesión y pues les esperamos en la próxima, el 22 de mayo. Quería decirlo también en español. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Estamos
muchas
en
gracias.
contacto.
Nos
Thank you
vemos
so
en
much.
mayo.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Tengan
Gracias.
muy buenas vacaciones de Semana Santa.
Sí.